When I wake up in the morning, I tend to find that our bathroom mirror gives a relatively clear and realistic depiction of my physical self. If I have a little bit of bedhead, you can see the bedhead. If I have some sleepy in my eye, you can see that in the mirror. If I've got a pimple on my chin, it is right there in the mirror to see. The mirror does not lie. But if I were to get up in the morning and look in the mirror expecting to see something of my internal understanding of my self-awareness, I would bet that it would not be a clear picture, but more like one of those funhouse mirrors where it looks kind of like you, but is really distorted. Because self-awareness is not something that we have all the time. We tend to be pretty good at self-justification and telling ourselves stories that don't necessarily provide a realistic picture of who we are and how we are functioning as a person. Jesus is hanging on the cross, and he's got these two people there with him. I find those two people to be quite important to the story, because if it's just Jesus on a cross all by himself, I'm not sure we as regular old humans can relate to the divine human Jesus as he goes through this struggle. But he has these two others there with him, and the two of them each have a different level of self-awareness. On the one hand, you have the first one who looks at Jesus as he's being mocked and teased and taunted by everyone, and kind of joins that and says, "Hey, what are you doing? Save us." He is in complete, in my mind, denial about what has gotten him to the cross, to the point that he's going to blame Jesus for not saving him, as opposed to reckoning with what it was that got him there in the first place. And I would bet that the morning of the crucifixions there, that he was sitting there saying, "Isn't this how it always goes? Everybody else does something wrong and I'm the one that gets caught." Or blaming it on somebody else, not taking responsibility for his own actions, all those kinds of things that we can do. Now, the other criminal is very self-aware, at least in the moment of the cross. But I would bet that morning that he was hanging out with the other criminal in their cell, talking about the same things, right? Like, yep, of course, this is how it always happens. It's guys like us that get the blame, even though we're just out there trying to work hard and make ends meet. But something happens on the cross. As the one is denying what has gotten him there and is blaming Jesus for not fixing it, the other one has a moment of clarity. And in that moment of clarity, he says to the first one, "Hey, buddy, we are supposed to be here. We have done bad things that have gotten us to this point, and we deserve this." Now, I might argue with him that anybody deserves to be hung on a cross, but his realization is to the point that he realizes he has done wrong. And in that moment, then, is able to turn to Jesus and have a moment of transformation and say, "Hey, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And in that, then, he gets this gift of Jesus telling him, "Today you will be with me in paradise." So that little bit of self-awareness in that place of crisis gets him to a place of transformation, while the other one is still in that place of denial. Now, I find these two to be important because I don't think these are just stories of a cross. I think they're stories that we see all the time around us. Early in my IT career, I was on a team of people right when I started, and we had this task of helping launch a company and get their stores open. And then once that was done, they took most of our team, like 30-some people, and rolled them off to be like help desk and support people, and they left two of us to be the people that would now run this team. Then they started to hire new people to be on the team, and my colleague and I, as we were teaching them the work that we did and supervising their work, very quickly figured out that they all knew that we used to be on the team and now we're running the team, and they knew we were going to be leaving eventually, so you could see them trying to figure out which of us that are on the team are going to get to run the team. And they were all angling for it. You could see it, right? In the way that they talked to us and the way they did their work. They were trying to prove themselves so they could take our place. What they did not know was that our manager and management team had already hired two people to take our place. They just hadn't gotten there yet. And eventually they did show up, these two women, and they worked alongside the two of us for a couple of months in time of transition. And as our time of leaving was approaching, the four of us sat down with our manager and we did performance appraisals. Now, most of them were pretty straightforward. We talked through how people had done their work and everything else. And these two women had way more experience and were way better at this job than my colleague and I were. We were still pretty green and new. And so they did a great job coaching us through this thing that they had done before. And then we got down to the last two people. The first one I'm going to call Leanne. When we got to Leanne, we all four agreed she didn't do any work. She'd go hide in a cube somewhere, she'd sit at her desk, but she always had a reason why her work wasn't getting done. We didn't give her the proper resources. Nobody helped her figure this other thing out. It wasn't clear the instructions we were given. That's not my job, that's your job, right? All kinds of reasons. And the four of us were of one mind, yep, she doesn't get her job done, and so we're going to have that conversation that you get 30 days to get better at your job or you're not going to have a job anymore. The other one, though, was different. I'm going to call him Carl. When we got to Carl, my colleague and I said, Carl's doing a pretty good job. He does everything we ask. He, for the most part, gets it done in a reasonable amount of time. I could use a little bit more creativity and proactivity, but I think we can work on those things given that, he's doing okay. The two women that we had been working with now for a couple months looked at us astonished. And they said, are you talking about Carl? And we're like, yeah, like the Carl that sits over there? And we said, yep. And they were like, that is not the same guy we work with. It turned out that Carl had been behaving totally differently with the two of them. If one asked him to do something, he would not do it and say the other one told him not to do it. Or he would prioritize the work we were doing and not the work that they had asked him to do. Now, this tells you that the four of us didn't communicate super good. Like, we had some work to do. But he was using that to his advantage, and in our mind, was trying to undermine them so that they would fail, so that when we left, maybe he could slide into that position. So his performance appraisal reflected all of that, and then it came time to deliver them. And we thought 4 sitting with 1 was probably too many, and so I got I don't know if that's the short or the long straw, of the two, my colleague and I, and then one of the women, and we sat down and had these conversations. And those conversations could not have gone more differently. We sat down with Leanne, shared her performance appraisal with her, and she continued to be defiant and in denial and self-justifying, not doing her job at all. To the point that the end of that conversation was having to get someone escort her to her desk so she could clean out her stuff, so she could be escorted out of the building while someone else was turning off all of her access to the systems. She still, even when the mirror was held up, had that distorted picture and could not see clearly. Now, when we sat down with Carl, something different happened. We slid his performance appraisal across the table, and as he read it, he began to weep. And not just a little bit of tears, right? Like full-on bawling in a conference room when he was confronted with how he had been behaving in a way that he did not even understand that he was doing himself. Now, this was an opportunity for transformation, and it actually happened, right? We had to have the same conversation. You got 30 days to get, change these behaviors, and he did. He started to work differently with those two women and respond to them differently and stop trying to work us against one another. Having been shown the reality of what was, he was able to change his behavior and live into a new space and be a productive member of this team. So you had one that still could not be self-aware, and one who this moment of crisis opened his eyes so that he could see things new. This is a story of an office with a conference room where we sit and had these conversations, but it's also the story of what happened with these two criminals on the cross, and it's a story that we repeat again and again. Luther said that we're simultaneously saint and sinner, right? We're all the time saints and all the time sinners. We don't have saint days and sinner days. Similarly, I think we are all the time simultaneously aware and unaware. We cannot know what we don't know about ourselves and see what we don't see. Some of that is hidden. Often it takes other people to point it out to us. Sometimes that pointing out is very painful because that reality that we denied and tried to pretend wasn't there, or whatever stories we told, when it finally gets held up, can be very uncomfortable. But it also can be a blessing because sometimes the thing that we don't see is positive. We don't see the positive impact we have on people, the blessing that we can be for other people. Because we tell ourselves or other people have said things about us, that tear us down, and we begin to believe that that is who we are. And whether we're self-justifying bad things or not seeing the good things, either way, Jesus on the cross meets us in that place. You do notice he's in between them, right? He's not on one side with both of them on the other. He's right in between the awareness and the unawareness, right? The one who can't see it. And when we talk about what Jesus came to do, it was to reconcile the whole creation, not to just gather up the handful that are self-aware all the time, which is zero, right? Because we're not all self-aware all the time. So Jesus comes and on that cross gathers up all of that tension that we live in between aware and unaware, and then in the resurrection brings transformation, but the transformation even happens for the one criminal while they're hanging there on the cross. And this is the gift then that we get, that even as we live in the already Jesus has saved us, but not yet all the way there time of tension, that we too have those moments of clarity and opportunities for transformation. Now, I would love to stand here and tell you that today, if you go home and do these 4 things, whatever they are, that you could come to a new place of self-awareness. There probably is a little bit of work we can do on that, but ultimately there's always going to be something that we do not see about ourselves. And it may be something terrible, and it may bring hurt and harm to other people. I may have shared this before with some of you. When I was on my last day of preaching class in seminary, our professor was kind of tidying up loose ends, and he said, "You all have chosen to speak out loud for a living." And we all nodded our heads, and they said, "This means you will say things you do not mean." And that kind of makes you pause. He goes, "You will say things that hurt other people, and they will never forgive you." And he kind of kept going, and it sounded bad. And I had already moved like 800 miles with my family and been through and I was like, is it too late to quit? And then he turned around and said, "You have chosen to speak out loud for a living, and because of that, you will have to talk through the world and think about things more deeply than otherwise. And you will say things that bless people and change their lives and never know it, because that's how God works." And then he went on, and then we were all kind of like, okay, that seems okay, right? But this is not just true of preaching, it's true of our lives. All of us, because we are simultaneously unaware and aware, will do things that hurt other people and we'll never know it, and they may never forgive us. But at the same time, we will do things that bless people and change their lives, and we will never know that. So instead of trying to spend all the time figuring out what we don't know, maybe the thing that we can do in this week where we celebrate Thanksgiving is be thankful for the things that we do know, and what we often do know is the way that people have blessed us. But they always don't know that. So this week I encourage you to think about some of those ways that people have touched your lives. Maybe it's opened up your own eyes. Maybe it's just been a blessing that carried you through a tough season. And if you haven't and can, get in touch with that person and say, "You know what? This is a time that you blessed me. This is a time that you did something that changed my life." I invite you to do that, because that gives them an opportunity to have their eyes opened a bit, an opportunity for the transforming love of God to kind of come into those spaces. And along the way, it will probably open our eyes as well to more about us and the work that God is doing in and with us as we go. Amen.